The frozen earth shook beneath Colonel Mikhail Volkov's boots, not from the German artillery falling on the outskirts of Moscow, not from the Katyusha rockets his battery had just launched toward the German lines 25 kilometers west. The ground trembled because winter had locked the soil solid as iron, and every explosion transmitted through bedrock like a hammer striking an anvil. December 19th, 1941. The temperature had dropped to minus 38 degrees Celsius. The Germans were close enough that Volkov could see the flash of their guns on clear nights, close enough that Soviet radio operators intercepted German communications about Christmas dinners they would eat in the Kremlin, close enough that every man in Volkov's artillery regiment understood they were the last organized military force between the Wehrmacht and the Soviet capital. Volkov stood at his observation post, a hastily dug bunker reinforced with logs cut from the surrounding forest. Ice crystals had formed on his eyebrows, despite the wool balaclava covering most of his face. His binoculars swept the tree line 400 meters ahead. The Germans had infantry dug in there. His guns had been dropping shells on those positions for 6 hours. Standard procedure: soften enemy positions, allow Soviet infantry to advance, hold the line one more day. But procedure had been abandoned 18 minutes ago when his radio operator received the fragmented transmission. Dmitri's tank company lost contact. Last position somewhere between the artillery line and the German-held village of Krasnaya Polyana. Somewhere in the frozen hell of no man's land, where disabled tanks became iron coffins and wounded men froze to death before medics could reach them. Volkov lowered his binoculars. His hands did not shake. 45 years of life, 23 years of military service, and 3 years of widowhood had taught him to control his body even when his mind screamed. His wife Anna had died in 1940 from pneumonia. Their son Dmitri, 19 years old, was now their only child, their only family, the last person on earth who carried Anna's eyes and her laugh and her stubborn refusal to accept defeat. Dmitri commanded a platoon of T-34 tanks, 5 tanks, 20 crew members, boys, most of them, volunteers and conscripts who believed tanks would win the war, who believed mobility and armor would overcome German firepower, who believed youth and courage could substitute for experience. Volkov had tried to keep his son out of tank service, had pulled strings, had called in favors. But Dmitri had wanted tanks. Fast, modern, powerful. Not the artillery, not the old man's guns that sat kilometers behind the lines and threw shells at enemies they never saw. The radio operator, a thin man named Petrov, whose frostbitten fingers could barely work the equipment, looked up from his set. His expression said everything. No further contact. No response to repeated calls. Tank companies did not go silent during combat unless something catastrophic had happened. Volkov made his decision in the space between heartbeats. He turned to his second-in-command, Major Sokolov, a veteran of the Finnish War whose left hand was missing 3 fingers from frostbite. Continue fire missions on schedule. Pattern 7, do not deviate. Sokolov understood immediately what Volkov intended. Sir, your orders are to maintain command of this position. Volkov was already moving toward the bunker entrance. He grabbed his rifle, a Mosin Nagant that had served in the previous war, and checked the action. 4 rounds in the magazine, 1 in the chamber. Not enough to fight off a German patrol, but enough to avoid capture. If I am not back in 2 hours, report to division headquarters that I died holding this position. They do not need to know anything else. Sokolov fell silent. Every man in the Red Army understood that orders and duty and the survival of the Soviet Union meant nothing compared to the survival of your own son. Volkov climbed out of the bunker into the killing cold. The forest was silent in the way that battlefields become silent between artillery barrages. Not peaceful, not calm, simply waiting for the violence to resume. Snow had fallen during the night, covering the shell craters and the frozen corpses and the abandoned equipment that littered the ground. The new snow made everything white and pure, as if nature was trying to hide the evidence of what men did to each other. Volkov moved through the trees in the direction of Dmitri's last reported position, northeast, toward the German lines. Every step took him farther from his command and closer to the enemy. He moved carefully. The snow crunched beneath his boots despite his attempts at stealth. In this cold, sound carried. A single German sentry could hear movement from 200 meters away. 20 minutes of walking brought him to a clearing. 3 T-34 tanks sat motionless in the snow. Their engines were cold. Their hatches hung open. No crew visible. No bodies. No blood in the snow. Just the tanks, abandoned, their dark green paint stark against the white ground. Volkov approached the nearest tank. The turret had been traversed to the left. The gun pointed at nothing. He climbed onto the hull, his boots slipping on the frozen metal, and looked into the crew compartment. Empty. Signs of hasty evacuation. A tanker's helmet left behind. A thermos of tea, frozen solid. The crew had abandoned their vehicle but not under fire. They had left in order. That meant they were alive. Somewhere, a sound reached him from deeper in the forest. Voices. Speaking Russian, Volkov moved toward the voices with his rifle at the ready. Through the trees, he saw them. A group of Soviet soldiers gathered around a depression in the ground. Tank crew by their leather jackets. Perhaps 15 men. Survivors from multiple tanks. They had their weapons out and were facing outward, establishing a defensive perimeter. And there, in the center of the group, was Dmitri. His son stood with his back to a fallen log, his tanker's uniform black with oil and carbon, his face covered in soot. He was speaking to the other tankers, giving orders. His voice carried through the cold air with the same clarity that Anna's voice had carried when she sang to infant Dmitri 20 years ago in their apartment in Moscow. Volkov did not call out, did not run forward. He simply walked into the clearing with his rifle lowered, and his son turned and saw him. For 3 seconds, neither man moved. Then Dmitri crossed the space between them in 4 quick steps and embraced his father. No words, just the physical contact between 2 people who thought they might never see each other again. Volkov felt his son's heartbeat through the layers of winter clothing, felt the trembling that Dmitri was trying to hide, felt the fear that every young soldier feels after their first real brush with death. They separated. Both men stepped back. Professional distance restored. Report, Volkov said. Dmitri's voice was steady. 3 tanks disabled by mechanical failure in the advance. Engine problems. Transmission failures. The cold is killing the machines faster than the Germans are. We evacuated the crews and withdrew on foot. No casualties. No contact with enemy forces. Where is the rest of your company? Unknown. Sir, we lost radio contact 2 hours ago. Lieutenant Fedorov's platoon was moving north. No confirmation of their position. Volkov looked at the gathered tankers. 15 men. Young. Exhausted. Alive. His son alive. Relief washed through him like warm water. Followed immediately by the cold calculation of duty. These men were combat ineffective without their tanks. They needed to be withdrawn to the artillery lines and then evacuated to rear positions for reassignment. Form column. We returned to my position. Volkov turned and began walking back the way he had come. Dmitri fell in beside him. The other tankers followed. They walked in silence for 10 minutes before Dmitri spoke quietly. For his father's ears only. You left your command post to find me. I left my command post to recover combat personnel who could not be contacted by radio. Father, that is what will be written in the report. Dmitri fell silent for a moment. Then, softer. Thank you. Volkov did not respond. A father does not thank his son for existing. A son does not thank his father for caring whether he lives or dies. These things exist beyond words. Beyond military discipline. Beyond the war that was consuming everything they knew. They reached the artillery position as the sun began to set. The temperature dropped another 5 degrees. Major Sokolov showed no surprise at seeing Colonel Volkov return with 15 tankers. He simply organized shelter for them and ensured they received hot food and medical attention for minor frostbite cases. That night, Volkov sat in his bunker writing his report. He described the recovery of disabled tank crews. He described the mechanical failures that had caused the loss of contact. He did not describe leaving his post. He did not describe the fear he had felt. He did not describe the embrace he had shared with his son. The war continued. The Germans launched a dawn attack that was repulsed by concentrated artillery fire. Soviet infantry counterattacked and gained 200 meters of frozen ground that had no strategic value except that it was 200 meters farther from Moscow. The tank crews, including Dmitri, were evacuated to the rear to await reassignment. Volkov did not see his son again for 3 weeks. When they next met, the war had changed. The German offensive on Moscow had been stopped. Soviet forces had launched counteroffensives all along the front. The immediate crisis had passed. The Soviet Union had survived the winter of 1941. Barely. A terrible calm, but it had survived. The meeting took place in Moscow, at the headquarters building on Frunzenskaya Street where Stavka, the Soviet High Command, coordinated the war. Volkov had been summoned from his position at the front. No explanation given. Simply orders to report immediately. He traveled by truck and then by train, arriving in Moscow to find the city transformed. The panic of December had been replaced by grim determination. Civilians reinforced buildings. Anti-aircraft guns dotted the rooftops. Everyone understood that the Germans would come again. That survival depended on preparation. Volkov was directed to a conference room on the building's 3rd floor. Inside, he found 30 artillery officers of varying ranks. Some he knew from the peacetime army. Others were strangers. All wore the same expression of exhaustion mixed with wariness. Officers summoned to Moscow often disappeared into the NKVD headquarters and were never seen again. The purges of the 1930s had taught everyone to fear unexpected summons. A general entered the room. General Konstantin Ivanov, 52 years old. Artillery specialist. Survivor of the purges through a combination of political loyalty and technical brilliance. He carried a leather folder stuffed with papers and charts. Ivanov did not waste time with preambles. Comrades, you have been assembled because our nation faces a question of survival. Not survival next week or next month. Survival over the next 3 years of war. What we decide in this room will determine whether the Soviet Union defeats Germany or whether Germany conquers us completely. The room was silent. Every man understood they were hearing something far beyond standard military briefing. Ivanov opened his folder and removed a chart. He pinned it to the wall. Production figures. Soviet industrial output compared to German industrial output. These are the numbers that keep Comrade Stalin awake at night. Germany produces 12,000 artillery pieces per year. We produce 28,000. Germany produces 4,000 tanks per year. We produce 12,000. But here is the problem that will decide the war. Ivanov removed another chart. Casualty rates. Equipment survival rates. Replacement timelines. When we lose a tank in combat, the average survival time for that tank from factory to destruction is 47 days. When we lose an artillery piece in combat, the average survival time for that gun from factory to destruction is 183 days. A tank requires a crew of 4 or 5 men trained for 9 to 12 months. An artillery piece requires a crew of 6 to 8 men trained for 4 to 6 months. When we lose a tank, we lose the vehicle and usually the entire crew. When we lose an artillery piece, we usually recover the gun and preserve most of the crew. Ivanov paused. Let the numbers sink in. Germany has superior tanks, superior aircraft, superior tactical coordination. But Germany has one weakness that will destroy them. They cannot replace their losses as quickly as we can replace ours. This is the mathematics of modern war. Comrades, victory goes not to the army with the best equipment, but to the army that can afford to lose equipment and still keep fighting. Volkov felt something click into place in his mind, something he had sensed during the desperate fighting of the past months but had not articulated. The war would not be won by superior tanks or superior tactics. It would be won by the side that could endure longer, that could absorb more punishment, that could trade lives and equipment for time and space until the enemy's will or resources broke. Ivanov continued, Comrade Stalin has made a decision. We will not attempt to match Germany in all categories of military equipment. We will not try to build better tanks than German tanks. We will not try to build better aircraft than German aircraft. Instead, we will concentrate our industrial capacity on the one weapon system where we have overwhelming advantage. Artillery. We will produce artillery in such quantities that we can achieve local superiority of 10 to 1, 20 to 1, 50 to 1. We will use massed artillery bombardment to destroy German defensive positions. Then our tanks and infantry will exploit the breakthrough. Artillery will be the hammer. Tanks will be the knife. One of the colonels raised his hand. Comrade General, this represents a fundamental change in military doctrine. What about the theories of mobile warfare? Deep battle. Combined arms? Ivanov's expression was hard. Combined arms requires coordination. Coordination requires communications. Communications require training and equipment we do not currently possess. The Germans have mastered combined arms. We have not. Therefore, we will not attempt to fight the Germans using their methods. We will fight them using Soviet methods. Mass, concentration, overwhelming firepower at the decisive point. Another officer spoke. The tank forces will resist this change. The tank forces will adapt to reality, or they will be replaced by officers who understand reality. Ivanov's tone left no room for debate. You have been selected for this program because your records indicate competence and political reliability. You will spend the next 3 months developing new artillery doctrines, training methods, deployment strategies, ammunition logistics. Every aspect of how the Red Army uses artillery will be revised. You will then return to your units and implement these changes. Questions? Volkov raised his hand. Comrade General, what is the human cost of this strategy? The room fell silent. It was a dangerous question. Implying concern for casualties could be interpreted as weakness or lack of revolutionary zeal. Ivanov looked at Volkov for a long moment. Colonel Ba, what is your name? Colonel Mikhail Volkov, 56th Artillery Regiment. You have a son serving in tank forces. Yes, Comrade General. Volkov's voice remained steady. Everyone knew the NKVD kept files on every officer. Everyone knew that family connections could be used against you. Your son survived the Moscow offensive despite the loss of his tank. Yes, Comrade General. Then you understand the mathematics better than most men in this room. Would you prefer your son serve in a tank that will be destroyed within 47 days? Or would you prefer a strategy that gives him a greater chance of survival, by keeping him away from the front lines while artillery does the killing. The question was not rhetorical. Ivanov wanted an answer. Volkov thought of Dmitri's face in the forest clearing, thought of the embrace they had shared, thought of Anna's voice asking him to keep their son safe, thought of duty and survival and the terrible calculus of war. I would prefer the strategy that wins the war, Comrade General, regardless of personal considerations. Ivanov nodded slowly, spoken like a true Soviet officer. But let me give you the answer you are afraid to speak aloud. Yes, Colonel, this strategy will save lives. Not all lives, not even most lives, but more lives than any alternative strategy available to us. We do not have the luxury of fighting clean wars. We do not have the luxury of minimizing casualties. We have only the luxury of choosing which casualties to accept. Artillery doctrine accepts higher infantry casualties in exchange for preserving our tank forces and our trained tank crews. It accepts longer battles in exchange for higher enemy casualties. It is brutal. It is cold. It is mathematics. But it will win the war. The room remained silent. Every man understood they had just been told something most military planners would never admit. War was mathematics. Victory was calculation. And human lives were numbers in an equation that someone had to solve. Ivanov dismissed them with orders to report to various training facilities. Volkov found himself assigned to a facility outside Moscow where new artillery methods would be developed and tested. He would spend 3 months there, 3 months away from the front, 3 months learning how to kill Germans more efficiently. He spent one night in Moscow before traveling to his new assignment. That evening, he saw Dmitri. His son had been reassigned to a training unit outside the city. Tank crews whose vehicles had been destroyed were being held in reserve while new tanks were manufactured. Dmitri looked older than he had 3 weeks earlier. The haunted expression that all combat soldiers develop had settled into his eyes. They met in a small cafe near the train station. The establishment was nearly empty. Most Muscovites could not afford cafe meals in the winter of 1942. But officers with money could still find hot tea and bread. They sat across from each other at a small table. For several minutes, neither spoke. Finally, Dmitri said, "They told me you were in Moscow. Special assignment. Something important. Artillery doctrine training. 3 months." Volkov sipped his tea. It was real tea, not the ersatz grain coffee that most people drank. They are reorganizing how we use artillery. Because artillery is winning battles and tanks are being destroyed. The bitterness in his son's voice was unmistakable. Volkov chose his words carefully. Tanks are being destroyed because we are learning how to use them. In the beginning, no one understood modern mechanized warfare. Now we are learning. The lessons are expensive. Expensive. Dmitri laughed. But there was no humor in it. 15 tanks in my company at the start of December. 3 left at the end. 47 crew members. 19 dead. 12 wounded seriously enough to be discharged. The rest of us waiting for new tanks so we can do it again. War is lost. War is arithmetic. Dmitri looked at his father. That is what they told us in the debriefing. Every battle is mathematics. Acceptable losses. Strategic objectives. Cost-benefit analysis. They talked about human beings like we were rifle rounds. Expendable. Replaceable. Volkov understood where his son was feeling. Had felt it himself after every battle where good men died because of orders he had given. The alternative is to lose the war. If we lose the war, Germany will kill every person in the Soviet Union they consider undesirable. Slavs, Jews, communists, anyone who resists. Millions will die. So yes, we calculate. We spend lives to save more lives. It is monstrous. But the alternative is more monstrous. Dmitri stared at his tea. Father, do you ever wonder if we could fight differently? If there was a way to win without so much death? Every day, but I have not found that way. Neither has anyone else. So we fight the war we can fight, not the war we wish we could fight. They sat in silence for a long time. Outside, snow began to fall. Moscow prepared for another night of blackout and cold, and waiting for the next German attack that everyone knew would eventually come. Finally, Dmitri spoke again. When you came to find me in the forest, you left your command post. You could have been court-martialed. Yes. Why did you do it? Volkov met his son's eyes. Because you are my son. Because your mother asked me to keep you safe before she died. Because some things matter more than orders. But you just said we have to calculate, have to accept losses, have to fight the war that wins, not the war we want. That is true for nations and armies. It is not true for fathers and sons. Volkov reached across the table and gripped Dmitri's hand. The war will demand everything from us. It will take our friends, our comrades, our peace of mind. It may take our lives, but it cannot take what we are to each other unless we allow it. I will not allow it. Dmitri's eyes were bright. If the artillery doctrine works, They will take tanks away from the front, make them support weapons. I will spend the rest of the war behind the lines while infantry die in my place. You will spend the rest of the war alive. That is all your mother asked of me. That is all I ask of you." They finished their tea. They parted on the street outside the cafe. Dmitri returned to his training unit. Volkov caught a train to his artillery training assignment. They would not see each other again for 7 months. The training program was brutal. Volkov and the other officers were taught new methods of calculating artillery fire, new techniques for concentrating guns on small frontages, new systems for ammunition supply that would allow sustained bombardments lasting hours instead of minutes. They studied German defensive doctrine and identified weaknesses. They studied Soviet offensive failures and analyzed what had gone wrong. And always, underlying every lesson, was the mathematics. How many guns needed to destroy a German defensive position? How many shells per gun? How long the bombardment needed to last? What infantry losses were acceptable? What tank losses were acceptable? Everything reduced to numbers on charts and equations and manuals. Volkov excelled in the program. His years of experience combined with natural analytical ability made him one of the top students. He was promoted to general and given command of artillery forces for a major offensive operation being planned for later in the year. Operation Uranus, the encirclement of Stalingrad. By November 1942, the battle for Stalingrad had become the focal point of the entire war. German forces had pushed deep into the city. Soviet forces clung to positions along the Volga River. The fighting was desperate, close range, building by building. But while the Germans were focused on the city itself, Soviet planners were organizing something unprecedented. A double encirclement, simultaneous attacks north and south of Stalingrad, break through German defensive lines held by Romanian and Italian forces, link up behind the German Sixth Army, trap 300,000 German soldiers in the ruins of the city they were trying to capture. The operation would require the largest concentration of artillery in Soviet history, 2,500 guns, 3,000 mortars, 10,000 tons of ammunition pre-positioned in depots. Volkov commanded the artillery for the northern thrust. His responsibility was to pulverize Romanian defensive positions along a 30-kilometer frontage in less than 2 hours. Then Soviet tank and infantry forces would pour through the gap and race south toward the link-up point. He established his command post in a bunker 10 kilometers behind the front lines. Maps covered every wall. Communications equipment filled one corner. Staff officers worked constantly updating information about gun positions, ammunition stocks, and German defensive deployments. 3 days before the operation, Dmitri appeared at the command post. He wore the uniform of a tank lieutenant. His unit, what remained of it, had been reformed and equipped with new tanks. They were assigned to the exploitation force that would follow the artillery breakthrough. Father and son stood together in the bunker, surrounded by maps and radios in the organized chaos of operational planning. They told us, "Your artillery will fire for 90 minutes. Dmitri said, 90 minutes of continuous bombardment. Is that possible? It is possible if the ammunition supply functions correctly, if the guns do not malfunction, if German counter-battery fire does not destroy too many of our positions. Everything must work." Volkov pointed to a map. "Your tanks will move through here. 15 minutes after the bombardment ends, the Romanian defenses should be completely destroyed. You should encounter minimal resistance." Should encounter. Nothing is certain in war. But the plan is sound. The resources are adequate. If we execute correctly, the Germans will be trapped. Dmitri studied the maps. "Father, if this works, if artillery really can destroy defensive positions this completely, then what good are tanks except to chase broken enemies?" It was the question that was dividing the Soviet military. Tank advocates argued for mobile warfare in breakthrough operations led by armor. Artillery advocates argued for firepower and systematic destruction of enemy forces. The debate had political dimensions, career implications, but underlying it was a simple question of effectiveness. Which weapon won battles? Volkov chose his words carefully. Tanks provide mobility. Artillery provides firepower. We need both. But if we must choose where to concentrate our resources, we choose the weapon that allows us to win with acceptable casualties. Right now, that weapon is artillery. In the future, if we can match German tactical skill, perhaps tanks will become dominant again. But today, in November 1942, artillery gives us the best chance of victory. You are killing the tank forces. I am trying to win the war. If that means tank forces become support weapons instead of primary weapons, then so be it. Your mother did not care whether you served in tanks or artillery. She cared that you survived. I care about the same thing. Dmitri looked at his father for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. I understand. I do not have to like it. But I understand. The operation launched on November 19th at 7:30 in the morning. Temperature minus 15 degrees. Sky overcast. No German aerial reconnaissance possible. Volkov stood in his bunker as the bombardment began. 2,500 guns fired nearly simultaneously. The sound was like the earth splitting open. Even 10 kilometers away, the bunker trembled. Dust fell from the ceiling. Radio communications became difficult because the noise overwhelmed everything. For 90 minutes, Soviet artillery poured shells onto Romanian positions. Forward observers reported that entire sections of the Romanian defensive line simply ceased to exist. Trenches collapsed. Bunkers imploded. Communications were severed. Command and control disintegrated. At 900 hours, the bombardment shifted deeper into Romanian rear areas. Soviet infantry and tanks moved forward. The breakthrough was complete within 4 hours. Romanian defenses collapsed. German forces rushed to plug the gap, but arrived too late. Soviet tank forces, including Dmitri's unit, poured through the breach and turned south towards Stalingrad. By November 23rd, the encirclement was complete. The German Sixth Army was trapped. Volkov received casualty reports in his bunker. Soviet infantry losses during the breakthrough. 1,200 killed. 3,000 wounded. Tank losses. 78 destroyed. Artillery losses. 43 guns destroyed by German counter-battery fire. By contrast, intelligence estimates suggested Romanian forces in the breakthrough sector had suffered 25,000 casualties. German forces that rushed to contain the breach had suffered another 8,000 casualties, mostly from artillery fire. The mathematics was stark. Artillery had killed Germans and Romanians at a ratio of 30-1 compared to Soviet losses. No other weapon system could achieve that efficiency. Volkov wrote his after-action report that night. He documented the success of concentrated artillery bombardment. He documented the importance of ammunition supply. He documented the coordination between artillery and tank forces. His report would become a template for future Soviet operations. But buried in the technical language was a simple truth. Artillery had won this battle. Not courage, not superior tactics, not clever generalship, simply overwhelming firepower concentrated on a narrow front for a limited time. It was brutal. It was industrial. It was mathematics. And it worked. Dmitri returned from the exploitation operation 3 weeks later. His tank unit had advanced over 100 kilometers, encountering scattered German resistance. They had lost 2 tanks to mechanical failure and 1 to a German anti-tank gun. But they had survived. The operation had been a success. Father and son met again in a small village near the front lines. Dmitri's face was hollow with exhaustion, but alive with something else. Understanding. Acceptance. They stood outside a damaged church that had been converted into a field headquarters. Snow fell lightly. In the distance, artillery continued to pound German positions around Stalingrad. Father, Dmitri said quietly, if artillery is this powerful, why do we need tanks at all? It was the question Volkov had been expecting. The question that would define Soviet military doctrine for the rest of the war. He looked at his son, saw the young man who had embraced him in the forest near Moscow 1 year ago, saw the officer who had survived when so many others had died, saw the future of the Red Army. We need tanks because artillery can destroy but cannot occupy. Artillery can break defensive lines but cannot exploit the breakthrough. Artillery can win battles but cannot win wars alone. Tanks give us mobility, speed, the ability to turn tactical victory into strategic victory. But make no mistake, Dmitri, artillery is the hammer that breaks the enemy. Tanks are the knife that finishes them. The hammer is more important than the knife. That is the lesson of Stalingrad. That is what will win this war. Dmitri looked toward the sound of distant guns. Then the future belongs to artillery. The future belongs to whoever can produce more shells than the enemy can endure. Germany cannot match our production. Germany cannot match our willingness to accept losses. Germany is fighting for conquest. We are fighting for survival. That difference will destroy them. They stood together in the falling snow. The war continued around them. The German Sixth Army was slowly being strangled in Stalingrad. Soviet forces were advancing on other fronts. The tide was turning, not because of miracle weapons or brilliant generals or revolutionary tactics, but because the Soviet Union had learned to fight the war it could win instead of the war it wanted to win. Volkov put his hand on his son's shoulder. The road ahead will be long. More battles. More losses. Germany will not surrender easily. But we will win. Not because we are better soldiers, not because we have better equipment, but because we can outlast them. Artillery gives us that ability. Dmitri nodded. I understand now. When this war is over, what will become of people like us? Tank officers who learn that tanks are not the decisive weapon. You will teach the next generation. You will ensure they understand that war is mathematics and survival, and the willingness to pay terrible prices. You will pass on the lessons we learned in blood. And you, Father, what will you do? Volkov looked toward Stalingrad, where hundreds of thousands of men were dying in the ruins of a city that had become a symbol. I will finish what we started. I will use artillery to break German power. And when the war is over, I will try to remember what it felt like to be something other than a calculator of death. They separated. Dmitri returned to his tanks. Volkov returned to his guns. The war continued. The mathematics continued. The dying continued. But the outcome was no longer in doubt. The Soviet Union had found its weapon, had found its strategy, had found the formula for victory. Artillery. Overwhelming. Concentrated. Relentless. The thunder that would eventually break Germany. The price of that thunder was being paid in blood. Would continue to be paid in blood. But the price would be paid because there was no alternative. This was the lesson of 1941 and 1942. Survival required sacrifice. Victory required calculation. War required mathematics. And in the frozen winter of Stalingrad, those equations were being written in fire and steel. Spring came slowly to the Kursk salient in 1943. The snow melted into mud that turned roads into rivers and fields into swamps. The ground, frozen solid for 6 months, thawed and released the smell of death. Bodies that had been buried under snow emerged. Equipment that had been abandoned in winter retreats became visible. The entire landscape revealed the archaeological layers of modern war. General Mikhail Volkov stood at a map table in a bunker 30 kilometers behind the front lines. April 15th. Intelligence reports covered the table. Aerial reconnaissance photographs. Prisoner interrogations. Radio intercepts, all pointing to the same conclusion. The Germans were planning something massive. The Kursk salient bulged westward into German-held territory like a fist. Soviet forces occupied the salient. German forces surrounded it on 3 sides. Elementary military logic suggested the Germans would attempt to cut off the salient, encircle the Soviet forces within, and destroy them. The question was not whether Germany would attack. The question was when and how to defeat them. Volkov's chief of staff, Colonel Petrov, pointed to the map. Intelligence estimates German forces will concentrate here, in the north, and here, in the south. Simultaneous attacks to meet somewhere in the middle. Classic encirclement operation. How many divisions? 30 to 35 divisions. Perhaps more. At least 20 Panzer and Panzer Grenadier divisions. They are bringing everything. Tiger tanks, Panthers, Ferdinands, the newest equipment, artillery. German artillery strength estimated at 4,000 guns total across both attack sectors. Volkov did the mathematics in his head. 4,000 German guns. Against how many Soviet guns? He looked at the figures his staff had compiled. Current artillery strength in the Kursk salient, 8,000 guns. Additional artillery that could be moved into position before the German attack. Another 6,000 guns. Total, 14,000 guns. Plus mortars. Plus Katyusha rocket launchers. 3-to-1 advantage in artillery. If properly concentrated. If properly supplied. If properly coordinated. We will build defensive positions in depth, Volkov said. 6 defensive belts. Each belt will be anchored by artillery positions with overlapping fields of fire. Anti-tank guns. Dug in and camouflaged. Minefields between the belts. When the Germans attack, they will advance into a killing zone 50 kilometers deep. Every kilometer they advance will cost them more than they can afford. Petrov hesitated. Comrade General, this strategy requires accepting that German forces will penetrate our initial defensive positions. It means allowing them to advance while we inflict casualties. It means trading space for German lives. Yes, that is exactly what it means. Volkov traced lines on the map. The Germans expect us to meet them at the front line, to commit all our forces immediately. Instead, we will let them exhaust themselves against prepared positions. And when they are weakened, we counterattack. Artillery will be the primary defensive weapon. Artillery will be everything. Infantry holds positions. Anti-tank guns destroy their armor. But artillery delivers the killing blows. Concentrate fire on their assembly areas before they attack. Concentrate fire on penetration points during their attack. Concentrate fire on their flanks and rear during their advance. Break their momentum. Break their will. Break their army. The planning consumed weeks. Through April and May, Soviet forces transformed the Kursk salient into the most heavily fortified position in military history. Trenches were dug, bunkers constructed, artillery positions prepared, ammunition depots established. Over 4 million artillery shells were stockpiled. The entire Soviet industrial system fed munitions into the salient. Volkov worked 18-hour days, coordinating artillery positions, training gun crews, establishing fire coordination procedures. Everything needed to function perfectly. A battle of this scale allowed no margin for error. In early June, his son arrived. Dmitri walked into Volkov's command bunker wearing a captain's uniform. He had been promoted. His tank company had been disbanded after suffering heavy casualties in operations around Kharkov. He was being reassigned to Volkov's staff. As a liaison officer coordinating tank and artillery operations, father and son stood on opposite sides of the map table. "You requested this assignment?" Dmitri said. "Not a question. An accusation." Volkov met his son's eyes. "I requested an experienced tank officer who understood combined arms doctrine. You qualified. There are 100 officers who qualified. You chose me because you want me away from the front lines. I chose you because you are competent, and I need competent officers." "Father," Dmitri's voice carried anger and something deeper. "Betrayal. I have survived 6 months of combat. I have earned the right to command tanks in battle. You are taking that from me." Volkov carefully rolled up one of the maps on the table. His hands did not shake, but the effort to control them was visible. "What I am taking from you is the statistical certainty of death. Tank commanders at Kursk will have a life expectancy measured in hours once the battle begins. Staff officers will survive. You will survive. That is not your decision to make. It is exactly my decision to make. I am your commanding officer. You are using your authority as a general to protect your son. That is not leadership. That is favoritism." The word hung in the air between them. Favoritism. In the Red Army, in the aftermath of the purges, favoritism was more than unprofessional. It was politically dangerous. Officers who showed favoritism could be accused of placing personal loyalty above loyalty to the state. The NKVD watched for such things. Volkov's voice was quiet. "Is that what you believe? That I am abusing my position?" Dmitri looked away. "I believe you are letting fear override judgment. Mother asked you to keep me safe, but she is dead. Father, her wishes do not obligate you to destroy my career. Your career means nothing if you are dead. Then why does anyone serve? Why does anyone fight? If survival is all that matters, we should all surrender tomorrow." Volkov walked around the map table until he stood directly in front of his son. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of 2 years of war and 47 years of life. "Dmitri, listen to me. In the coming battle, the Germans will commit everything they have. We will meet them with everything we have. The casualties will be catastrophic on both sides. Tank forces will be tracerated. This is not speculation. This is mathematical certainty based on the forces involved and the terrain. If you command tanks at Kursk, you will die. Not possibly, not probably. You will die. I have already lost your mother. I will not lose you. Thousands of other men will die. Sons of other fathers. Why should I be spared? Because I have the power to spare you, and I choose to use that power. Call it favoritism if you wish. Report me to the NKVD if your conscience demands it. But you will remain on my staff." They stared at each other. The silence stretched. Finally, Dmitri spoke. "If I remain, I will request front-line duty if the battle goes badly. If our forces are in danger of collapse, staff officers will be committed to combat. When that happens, I will not hide behind your authority." Agreed. It was not reconciliation. It was compromise born from the impossibility of resolution. Dmitri took his position on Volkov's staff. He worked competently. He spoke to his father only when duty required. The distance between them grew even as they worked in the same bunker. Volkov told himself it was necessary. Told himself survival justified the cost. Told himself Dmitri would understand eventually. He did not believe any of it. 400 kilometers south. On the German side of the front, General Major Wilhelm Hartmann received his orders for Operation Citadel. Hartmann was 47 years old. Artillery commander, veteran of the Great War where he had served as a young lieutenant. He had survived Verdun and the Somme, had learned that artillery won battles and infantry died for artillery's mistakes, had spent 25 years studying the science of massed firepower. He sat in his headquarters reviewing the operational plan. 9th Army would attack from the north, 4th Panzer Army from the south. They would meet in the middle, cutting off Soviet forces in the Kursk salient. His artillery would support the southern thrust. 4 panzer divisions, 10 infantry divisions, 1,000 1,000 tanks, 800 guns under his direct command. His chief of staff, Major Klein, stood beside the desk. "Herr General, the latest intelligence estimates suggest Soviet artillery strength in the salient has increased significantly. Perhaps 10,000 guns or more." 10,000, ma'am. Hartmann said it quietly. Doing the mathematics, Soviet artillery outnumbered German artillery by more than 2 to 1. And our ammunition allocation, sufficient for 5 days of intensive operations. After that, we must rely on whatever can be brought forward from supply depots. 5 days. Hartmann had fought on the Eastern Front long enough to understand what that meant. Germany was gambling that 5 days of ammunition would be enough to break Soviet defenses and encircle Soviet forces. After 5 days, if the breakthrough had not been achieved, German forces would be unable to sustain offensive operations. The Soviets had no such limitation. Their ammunition stocks were effectively unlimited. Soviet factories produced shells faster than Soviet guns could fire them. Germany could not match that production, could not match that logistics, could not win a sustained artillery duel. This operation needed to succeed quickly, or it would not succeed at all. Hartmann's adjutant entered the office. Herr General, there is a message from your son. Hartmann felt his stomach tighten. His son, Peter, was a lieutenant in an infantry regiment, 22 years old, idealistic, brave, convinced that Germany would win the war through superior will and tactics. Peter had survived 2 years on the Eastern Front, had been wounded once at reshape, had received the Iron Cross for leading a counterattack that saved his company from encirclement. What does the message say? His regiment has been assigned to Operation Citadel. They will be part of the second wave, following the panzer breakthrough. Following the panzer breakthrough, which meant following tanks into a defensive system the Soviets had spent 3 months preparing. Following tanks into the killing zones that Soviet artillery had pre-registered. Following tanks into the mathematical certainty of high casualties, Hartmann dismissed his adjutant, sat alone in his office, looked at the map showing the attack plan, looked at the casualty estimates his staff had prepared. Conservative estimates suggested German casualties for Operation Citadel would exceed 60,000 men. More realistic estimates doubled that number. His son would be among those statistics. Unless Germany achieved breakthrough so rapidly that Soviet defenses collapsed, unless Soviet artillery proved less effective than intelligence suggested, unless tactical brilliance overcame material disadvantage, unless miracles happened. Hartmann did not believe in miracles. He believed in artillery and logistics and the grim calculus of combat power. And those calculations suggested Operation Citadel was a gamble Germany could not afford. But the orders had been given. The operation would proceed, and Hartmann would do his duty, just as every German officer would do his duty, just as every German soldier would do his duty. And they would pay the price that duty demanded. The night before the offensive, Hartmann wrote a letter to his wife. He did not mention his doubts about the operation, did not mention his fears for their son. He wrote about the weather and the countryside and small things that had nothing to do with war. Then he sealed the letter and gave it to his adjutant with instructions to mail it if Hartmann did not survive the coming battle. He spent the rest of the night reviewing artillery fire plans, checking ammunition stocks, ensuring his guns were positioned correctly. Professional competence was all he could offer. If Germany was about to make a mistake, at least Hartmann would execute his part flawlessly. On the Soviet side, Volkov made his own preparations. He had divided the Kursk salient into sectors. Each sector had assigned artillery units with overlapping fields of fire. He had established ammunition supply schedules that would allow sustained bombardment for weeks if necessary. He had trained forward observers to call fire accurately and quickly. He had created redundant communication systems so that even if primary networks were destroyed, artillery could still be coordinated. And he had developed something new, something the Germans did not expect. Preemptive bombardment. Soviet intelligence knew when the German offensive would begin. July 5th, early morning. Reconnaissance had identified German assembly areas, positions where German forces were concentrated, preparing to attack. Volkov had positioned artillery to target those assembly areas. At 0230 hours on July 5th, 30 minutes before the scheduled German attack, Soviet artillery would open fire, not on German defensive positions, on German offensive forces, disrupting their attack before it began. It was a calculated risk. If Soviet intelligence was wrong about the timing, the bombardment would waste ammunition. But if intelligence was correct, the preemptive strike would throw German attack plans into chaos. Volkov believed the intelligence was correct. He staked his career and the lives of thousands of men on that belief. July 4th, evening. The last night of peace before the storm, Dmitri found his father standing outside the command bunker, looking south toward the German lines. The sun was setting. The sky was the color of fire. They will attack tomorrow, Dmitri said. Yes, your preemptive bombardment. If it fails, you will be blamed. If it fails, whether I am blamed will not matter. The Germans will achieve breakthrough, and this entire defensive system will collapse. They stood in silence, watching the sunset, knowing that tomorrow the sky would be filled with smoke and fire and death. Father, Dmitri's voice was quiet. I understand why you wanted me on your staff. I do not agree with it, but I understand. Volkov remained silent. If I die tomorrow, I want you to know that I do not blame you for anything. Mother's death was not your fault. Your decisions in this war are not cruelty. You are trying to save people. I see that now. You will not die tomorrow. You will remain in this bunker coordinating tank movements. Yes, father. But both men knew that if the battle went badly, everyone would die. Staff officers and tank commanders and artillery crews and infantry soldiers. The Germans would kill them all if they broke through. And despite all the preparations, despite all the artillery and all the planning, breakthrough was possible. War was mathematics, but mathematics sometimes produced unexpected results. They returned to the bunker. The night passed slowly. At 0200 hours, Volkov gave the order, commence preemptive bombardment. Along the entire southern sector of the Kursk salient, 2,000 Soviet guns opened fire simultaneously. The target was not German defensive positions. The target was German forces assembled in attack positions, tanks, infantry, artillery, support vehicles, all concentrated in relatively small areas. Waiting for the order to advance, Soviet shells rained down on those assembly areas for 30 minutes. The bombardment was not designed to destroy German forces completely. It was designed to disrupt, to create chaos, to force German commanders to reorganize their attack under fire. The German response was confusion. Forward units reported heavy artillery fire. Communications networks reported damage to command posts. Tank units reported casualties from shell fire before they had even begun their attack. At 0300 hours, the scheduled time for the German offensive to begin, many German units were still reorganizing. The attack was delayed. When German forces finally advanced at 0430, they were 90 minutes behind schedule and considerably more disorganized than planned. Hartmann received the reports in his headquarters. Soviet artillery had struck German assembly areas. Casualties were significant but not catastrophic. 200 dead, 500 wounded, 30 tanks damaged, multiple command posts destroyed. The offensive would proceed, but its carefully timed coordination had been thrown into chaos. He understood immediately what had happened. Soviet intelligence had known the German attack schedule. Soviet artillery had exploited that knowledge. It was exactly what Hartmann would have done if the situations were reversed. Professional respect for the enemy was a luxury Germany could no longer afford. But Hartmann felt it anyway. Somewhere on the Soviet side was an artillery commander who understood modern warfare as well as any German officer. Perhaps better. The battle began. German forces advanced into Soviet defensive positions. Tiger tanks led the assault. Panthers followed. Infantry moved behind the armor. German artillery provided support, but was immediately engaged by Soviet counter-battery fire. Every time a German gun fired, Soviet artillery targeted it. The Soviets had more guns, more shells, more forward observers. They could afford to trade shells for time. The first German assault wave reached Soviet defensive lines and encountered minefields. Engineers moved forward to clear paths. Soviet artillery targeted the engineers. German infantry attempted to suppress Soviet defensive positions. Soviet artillery targeted the infantry concentrations, kilometer by kilometer. German forces advanced, kilometer by kilometer. Casualties mounted. The breakthrough that was supposed to happen in hours was taking days. Soviet defensive positions that were supposed to collapse were holding. Volkov watched the battle unfold from his command bunker. Reports flowed in constantly. German penetrations here. Soviet counterattacks there. Casualty figures. Ammunition expenditure rates. Requests for artillery support. He coordinated fire missions with mechanical precision. Target identified. Artillery assigned. Fire mission executed. Target destroyed or suppressed. Next target identified. The cycle repeated hundreds of times per day. His staff worked in shifts. The guns fired continuously. Ammunition trucks arrived from depots every 6 hours. The mathematics of the battle were exactly as he had calculated. Soviet artillery was killing Germans faster than German artillery could kill Soviets. Soviet defensive positions were being destroyed, but German offensive forces were being destroyed faster. The trade ratio favored the defense. Germany was losing the battle even as German forces advanced. Dmitri worked at a plotting table, tracking tank movements. Soviet tank reserves were being held back, waiting for the moment when German offensive strength was exhausted. Then Soviet tanks would counterattack, but not yet, not while German armor was still strong. July 12th, 8 days into the battle. The German offensive had penetrated 15 kilometers into Soviet defenses. German casualties exceeded 30,000. Tank losses exceeded 300. The offensive was slowing, running out of momentum, running out of men. That morning, Dmitri received orders. His old tank brigade, reformed with new vehicles, was being committed to counterattack in the Prokhorovka sector. They needed experienced officers. They needed him. He went to his father. Volkov was studying casualty reports when Dmitri entered his office space in the bunker. Father and son looked at each other. "You heard," Volkov said. "I heard. They need tank officers at Prokhorovka." "I volunteered." "No, father. The battle is at its crisis point. We are about to counterattack. This is not the time for staff officers to remain in bunkers while combat officers die. You said I could request frontline duty if the battle went badly. The battle is not going badly, but it is going critically. I am going. Volkov wanted to refuse. Does. Wanted to order his son to remain, wanted to use his authority to keep Dmitry alive. But he could not, because Dmitry was right. The battle was at its crisis point. Every capable officer was needed, and refusing to release his son now, when other officers were dying, would be the worst kind of favoritism, would be everything he had claimed he was not doing. You will command 2nd Company, 4th Tank Brigade, Volkov said quietly. They have 15 T-34s. Experienced crews. Your mission is to engage German armor in the Prokhorovka sector and prevent breakthrough. Intelligence suggests the Germans are committing their remaining tank reserves. This will be the decisive engagement. I understand. Dmitry. Volkov's voice cracked slightly. He steadied it. Follow orders. Stay with your unit. Do not attempt individual heroics. Tank battles are won by coordination, not courage. Yes, father. They did not embrace, could not embrace. Not here. Not in front of the staff officers who worked around them. They stood facing each other for 3 seconds. Then Dmitry saluted and left. Volkov returned to his maps, to his casualty reports, to his calculations, but his hands shook now and he could not stop them. The Battle of Prokhorovka began at 0830 on July 12th. German forces committed over 300 tanks in a final attempt to break through Soviet defenses. Soviet forces committed over 600 tanks to stop them. The battle took place in a relatively small area, perhaps 20 square kilometers, over 900 tanks fighting in confined terrain. It was the largest tank battle in history. Dmitry's company engaged German armor at 0915. His 15 T-34s against perhaps 40 German tanks. Panthers, Mark IVs, some Tigers. The Germans had superior armor, superior guns, superior optical equipment. But the Soviets had numbers and artillery support. Dmitry commanded from his T-34. Standing in the commander's cupola despite the danger, he needed to coordinate his company, needed to identify targets. The battle was chaos. Tanks moving, firing, exploding, smoke everywhere. Impossible to distinguish friend from enemy beyond 100 meters. Radio communications fragmentary. Orders shouted over the roar of engines and guns. A Panther appeared through the smoke. 200 meters. Turret traversing toward Dmitry's tank. His gunner saw it simultaneously. Panther. Front. 200. Fire. The T-34's gun fired. The shell struck the Panther's frontal armor and ricocheted. No penetration. The German tank's gun was still traversing toward them. Reverse! Reverse! Dmitry's driver threw the tank into reverse. The T-34 backed rapidly, trying to break line of sight. The Panther fired. The shell passed through the space where Dmitry's tank had been 3 seconds earlier. Forward. Angle. Target his side. The T-34 surged forward at an angle. The Panther was turning to track them but was slower. Dmitry's gunner acquired the target. Side armor. Vulnerable. Fire. The shell struck the Panther's side armor and penetrated. The German tank erupted in flame. Crew bailed out. 1 man on fire. 2 running. His gunner machine gunned the runners. Standard procedure. Brutal but necessary. Next target. Another German tank. Another engagement. Fire. Maneuver. Fire again. Around Dmitry's company. The battle raged. Tanks dying on both sides. Crews burning. Soviet infantry with anti-tank rifles engaging German armor from flanks. German infantry with Panzerfaust targeting Soviet tanks. And above it all, constantly, Soviet artillery falling on German positions. Volkov's guns reaching out from positions 15 kilometers away, targeting German tank concentrations, targeting German infantry, targeting German artillery positions. The Germans were fighting the Soviet tanks, but they were also fighting the entire Soviet artillery force. And the artillery was killing them. At 10:42, Dmitry's tank took a hit. A German anti-tank gun, positioned in a tree line, camouflaged, waiting. Standard ambush tactics. Dmitry never saw it. The shell struck his T-34's side armor at an angle. Penetrated. Entered the crew compartment, traveling at supersonic speed. Struck something inside. Exploded. The explosion filled the crew compartment with fire and overpressure and shrapnel. Dmitry's driver died instantly. His body torn apart. The gunner died 3 seconds later. His chest crushed by debris. The loader was thrown against the turret wall and knocked unconscious. Dmitry survived because he was standing in the commander's cupola. The explosion threw him out of the tank. He landed 8 meters away in mud, created by the churning tracks of dozens of tanks. He lay on the ground, unable to move. His back was on fire. His uniform was on fire. He tried to roll, but his body would not respond to his brain's commands. The fire spread across his shoulders and neck. Someone grabbed him, rolled him in the mud, extinguishing the flames. A Soviet infantryman, young, terrified, but doing his job, helping wounded soldiers. The infantryman dragged Dmitry away from the burning tank, away from the battle, toward a medical collection point 500 meters behind the lines. Other soldiers helped. They moved Dmitry carefully. His skin was burned. Large sections of his back and shoulders looked like raw meat. The pain had not arrived yet. Shock was protecting him, but the pain would come. At the medical collection point, a doctor examined Dmitry quickly, assessed the burns, made a decision. He needs to be evacuated immediately. These burns are severe. He will not survive without proper treatment. They loaded Dmitry onto a truck. 10 other wounded men shared the space. The truck drove north, away from the battle, toward a field hospital 20 kilometers behind the lines. In his command bunker, Volkov continued coordinating artillery. The Battle of Prokhorovka continued. German forces were being stopped. Soviet counterattacks were gaining ground. The crisis was passing. The German offensive was failing. At 14:30 hours, a staff officer approached Volkov. The officer's expression told him everything before words were spoken. "Comrade General, your son, he has been wounded. His tank was destroyed. He has been evacuated to the field hospital at Oboyan." Volkov did not move, did not speak. For 5 seconds, he simply stood, processing the information. Wounded, not killed. Wounded meant alive. Wounded meant possibility of survival. How severe are his wounds? I do not have details. Comrade General, only that he required immediate evacuation. Volkov turned to his chief of staff. Colonel Petrov, assume command. Continue current fire missions. I will return in 6 hours. Comrade General, the battle is not yet concluded. Your presence is not required for another 6 hours. Colonel, you know the plan. You know the procedures. Execute them. Volkov left the bunker, climbed into a vehicle, drove north through roads clogged with supply trucks and ambulances and reinforcements moving toward the front. It took 90 minutes to reach the field hospital. The hospital was a collection of tents and dugouts, organized chaos of wounded men and overworked medical personnel. Volkov found the chief surgeon, a woman in her 30s with blood on her uniform and exhaustion in her eyes. I am looking for Captain Dmitry Volkov, tank officer, evacuated from Prokhorovka this afternoon. The surgeon consulted a list. Third tent, burn ward. Volkov walked to the third tent. Inside, 30 men lay on cots. Most were unconscious. Many were bandaged so heavily their faces were invisible. The smell was overwhelming. Burned flesh, antiseptic, gangrene, death. He found Dmitry on a cot in the corner. His son lay on his stomach. His back and shoulders were covered in bandages. The bandages were already seeping blood and fluid. His face was turned to the side. His eyes were closed, but he was breathing. A nurse saw Volkov approach. Are you family? I am his father. He is stable, but his burns are severe. Second and third degree, burns covering approximately 40% of his body, mostly his back and shoulders. He will survive, but the recovery will be long. Months, perhaps longer. He will be transported to a proper hospital in Moscow tomorrow. Is he conscious? He was given morphine for the pain. He may wake soon. Volkov sat on a wooden stool beside the cot. He looked at his son, at the bandages covering the burns he had tried so hard to prevent, at the young man whose life he had tried to preserve by keeping him away from tanks and combat and danger. All for nothing. All the authority, all the favoritism he had denied committing, but had absolutely committed. All meaningless, because in the end, duty had demanded that Dmitry return to combat, and combat had taken its price. Dmitry's eyes opened, focused slowly, saw his father. Father, his voice was weak. Morphine dulled. I am here. My crew. I do not know. I will find out. The battle. We are winning. The Germans are being stopped. Your sacrifice was not in vain. Dmitry tried to laugh, but the pain stopped him. Sacrifice. You chose artillery over tanks. You chose the doctrine over me. And I still got burned. Dmitry, you were right. Father, artillery is more important than tanks. More important than individual soldiers. More important than sons. There was no bitterness in his voice. Only acceptance. Understanding born from pain and morphine, and the clarity that comes from facing death. You chose artillery to save thousands like me, but you could not save me. Volkov felt something break inside him. Something that had held firm through 2 years of war and hundreds of calculated decisions and thousands of deaths. The barrier between the general who calculated casualties and the father who loved his son. I am sorry, he said quietly. I tried to protect you. I failed. No. Dmitri's hand moved slightly. Reaching, Volkov took his son's hand carefully. You did not fail. I am alive. Others are alive because of your artillery. That is not failure. That is victory, even if the price is terrible. They sat in silence, father holding son's hand. Around them, the field hospital continued its work. Surgeons operated. Nurses changed bandages. Wounded men died or survived according to mathematics that had nothing to do with courage or duty. Your mother would be proud of you, Volkov said finally. She would be proud of both of us. For doing what needed to be done, Volkov stayed until Dmitri fell unconscious again. Then he returned to his vehicle, drove back to his command bunker, resumed coordinating artillery. The battle continued. The war continued. The mathematics continued. But something had changed. The price of victory was no longer abstract. It was measured in his son's flesh, in burns that would scar him for life, in a combat career ended before it really began. 400 kilometers south, Hartmann received a different report. His son's regiment had been committed to combat at Prokhorovka. The regiment had advanced with German armor. The Soviet counterattack had overwhelmed them. The regiment had suffered 80% casualties. Survivors had withdrawn in disorder. Lieutenant Peter Hartmann was missing, presumed dead. Hartmann sat in his headquarters as the reports came in. German offensive failing. Tank losses unsustainable. Infantry casualties catastrophic. Operation Citadel was over. The battle was over. Germany had lost, and his son was dead. He wrote no letters that night, filed no reports, simply sat in his office, looking at a photograph of Peter in his uniform. 22 years old, dead in a Russian field. For nothing. For an offensive that failed. For a war that was already lost, even if Germany did not yet admit it. The mathematics had spoken. Soviet artillery had broken German power. Soviet industrial capacity had defeated German tactical skill. Soviet willingness to accept casualties had overcome German attempts to minimize them. The price of that mathematics was paid in blood. German blood and Soviet blood. Peter Hartmann's blood and Dmitri Volkov's scarred flesh. Two fathers, two sons. Two nations locked in a death struggle where victory and defeat were measured in calculations that treated human beings as numbers and equations. The Battle of Kursk continued for another month. German forces gradually withdrew. Soviet forces gradually advanced. By August, the battle was over. German casualties, over 200,000. Soviet casualties, over 800,000. But Germany had lost the strategic initiative, would never launch another major offensive on the Eastern Front. The war had turned permanently in Soviet favor, because artillery had broken German power, because Soviet industrial capacity had prevailed, because Volkov's mathematics had proven correct. The price of that correctness was measured in field hospitals and missing person reports and burn wards, where young men learned to live with scars that would never fully heal. Volkov visited Dmitri once more before his son was evacuated to Moscow. They spoke briefly, made plans for recovery, promised to write letters. Neither mentioned the cost. Neither needed to. Both understood that victory required sacrifice. That war was mathematics. That duty sometimes demanded everything from everyone. Dmitri would survive, would eventually teach at an artillery academy, would pass on the lessons learned at Kursk, would ensure the next generation understood that firepower, properly concentrated, could break any defense. But he would never again command tanks, never again lead men into combat. His war was over at age 21. The price of his father's artillery doctrine, the price of Soviet victory, the price of thunder. Summer returned to Russia in 1944. The snow and ice that had defined 2 winters of war melted away, revealing a landscape transformed by violence. Where forests had stood, there were now fields of stumps. Where villages had existed, there were now foundations and chimneys pointing at empty sky. The earth itself bore scars, shell craters, tank tracks, trenches that stretched for kilometers. The war had moved west. Soviet forces, having stopped the German army at Kursk, were now advancing, slowly, methodically, pushing German forces back toward Poland and the borders of the Reich itself. Every kilometer cost blood. Every village cost casualties. But the direction was clear. The Wehrmacht was retreating. The Red Army was advancing. General Mikhail Volkov stood in a briefing room in Minsk, studying maps of Belarusia. June 10, 1944. Around the table sat commanders from 3 Soviet fronts, generals and colonels, artillery specialists and infantry commanders, tank officers and logistics experts. They were planning the largest Soviet offensive operation of the entire war. Operation Bagration. The objective was straightforward. Destroy German Army Group Center. 3 German armies, over 800,000 men, occupying defensive positions across Belarusia. The operation would involve coordinated attacks by multiple Soviet fronts, simultaneous breakthroughs at 6 different points, encirclement and destruction of German forces on a scale that would dwarf even Stalingrad. The artillery resources available for this operation were unprecedented. 31,000 guns, 5,000 Katyusha rocket launchers, 15,000 mortars, over 2 million tons of ammunition pre-positioned in depots stretching from Smolensk to Kiev. Volkov commanded artillery coordination for the entire operation. His responsibility was to ensure that artillery fire supported breakthrough operations across a front 700 kilometers wide, that guns were positioned correctly, that ammunition was available when needed, that fire missions were executed with precision. It was the culmination of everything he had learned since 1941. Every lesson, every calculation, every brutal compromise between effectiveness and humanity. Comrade General, a staff officer approached with a message. Your son has sent word from Moscow. He wishes you to know that he has completed his medical treatment and has accepted a position teaching artillery tactics at the Frunze Academy. Volkov nodded. He had not seen Dmitri since Kursk. 11 months ago, they exchanged letters. Careful letters that discussed tactics and doctrine and never mentioned the burns that had ended Dmitri's combat career. Never mentioned the cost of victory. Never mentioned the price that had been paid. Dmitri was alive, was healing, would teach the next generation of Soviet officers. It was more than most fathers in the Red Army could say about their sons. Volkov told himself this was enough. Told himself survival justified everything. He almost believed it. The briefing continued. Commanders discussed breakthrough sectors, infantry assault plans, tank exploitation routes, logistics schedules. The operation would begin June 23rd. 2 weeks away. Every hour of those 2 weeks would be spent in final preparations. Volkov worked without rest, coordinating artillery positions for 3 fronts, establishing fire control procedures, training forward observers, calculating ammunition expenditure rates, creating backup plans for when the original plans failed. Because plans always failed. The question was whether the failure was catastrophic or merely inconvenient. On the German side of the front, General Major Wilhelm Hartmann received orders that told him his war was ending. Not ending in victory, not ending in honorable peace, ending in inevitable defeat. His artillery corps had been moved to Belarusia in May. They were part of the defensive forces attempting to hold Soviet advances, but the resources available were inadequate. 800 guns to cover a sector that required 3,000, ammunition rationed to 20 shells per gun per day. No reserves, no reinforcements, no hope of matching Soviet firepower. Hartmann understood the mathematics, had understood them since Kursk. Germany could not win a production war against the Soviet Union, could not replace losses as quickly as the Soviets replaced theirs, could not sustain offensive operations, could now barely sustain defensive operations. The war was lost. Every professional German officer knew this. But the war would continue because surrender was not possible. Because Hitler refuses to accept reality. Because stopping now meant admitting that millions had died for nothing. So the war would continue until Germany was completely destroyed, until every German soldier was dead or captured, until the Reich ceased to exist. Hartmann sat in his headquarters bunker, reading intelligence reports about Soviet preparations. The reports were fragmentary but consistent. Massive Soviet buildup. Artillery concentrations exceeding anything seen before. Ammunition stockpiles that suggested sustained operations lasting months. He thought about his son, about Peter, missing at Kursk, presumed dead. There had been no body, no confirmation, simply the absence of Peter from the lists of survivors and prisoners. For a year, Hartmann had existed in the limbo of not knowing, not able to grieve because there was no certainty of death, not able to hope because the odds of survival were so small. He worked, commanded his artillery, did his duty, but part of him had died at Kursk alongside the son he would never see again. June 23rd arrived. At 0400 hours, Soviet artillery began firing along the entire Belarusian front. 31,000 guns, firing simultaneously. The sound was audible 100 kilometers away. The earth trembled. The sky turned orange with muzzle flashes. The air itself seemed to catch fire. The bombardment lasted 2 hours. German defensive positions ceased to exist. Bunkers collapsed. Communication trenches were obliterated. Command posts were buried. Soldiers who survived the initial bombardment emerged from shelters to find their world transformed into a lunar landscape of craters and corpses. Then Soviet infantry attacked, supported by tanks, covered by artillery that continued firing, walking barrages that advanced ahead of the infantry at a rate of 100 meters every 3 minutes. German soldiers who tried to establish defensive positions were immediately targeted by Soviet artillery. Those who survived the bombardment were overrun by Soviet infantry. By the end of the first day, Soviet forces had penetrated 15 kilometers into German lines at multiple points. By the end of the second day, the penetrations had widened into breakthroughs. By the end of the first week, German Army Group Center was fragmenting. Volkov coordinated artillery from his command bunker, moving fire missions across the front like a conductor directing an orchestra. His staff worked in continuous shifts. Sleep was rationed to 4 hours per day. Food was eaten at desks while reviewing reports. The operation consumed everything. But it was working. The breakthrough was succeeding. German forces were retreating in disorder. Soviet mobile forces were exploiting gaps. The encirclements that had been planned were beginning to form. On June 30th, a German artillery corps attempted to establish a defensive line near Bobrus. They had perhaps 200 guns, adequate ammunition, good defensive terrain. Under normal circumstances, they might have held for days. Volkov allocated 4,000 Soviet guns to destroy that defensive line. The bombardment lasted 6 hours. When it ended, the German defensive position no longer existed. Survivors surrendered. Among them was General Major Wilhelm Hartmann. Hartmann stood with his hands raised as Soviet soldiers searched him for weapons. His uniform was covered in dust. His face was gray with exhaustion. Around him, other German prisoners sat or stood, waiting to learn their fate. A Soviet colonel approached, spoke German with a Ukrainian accent. "You are the commander of this artillery unit?" "I was." "Your rank?" "General Major." "You will be transported to a collection point for senior officers. Do you have personal effects you wish to carry?" Hartmann thought of the photograph of Peter he kept in his uniform pocket, the only picture he had of his son. But what did photographs matter now? What did anything matter? "No, I have nothing." The colonel nodded, gestured to guards. Hartmann was loaded onto a truck with 20 other German officers. The truck drove east, away from the battle, towards Soviet rear areas. The collection point was a former Soviet military barracks. German officers were separated by rank, generals in one building, field-grade officers in another. Hartmann was placed in a room with 5 other German generals, all artillery or infantry commanders, all captured during the same offensive. They sat on wooden bunks and did not speak. Nothing to say. They had lost. Their armies were being destroyed. Their nation was being invaded. Whatever happened next would happen regardless of words. On the third day of captivity, Soviet guards brought Hartmann to an interrogation room. A Soviet intelligence officer sat behind a desk. Young, competent-looking, fluent in German. "General Major Hartmann, I am Captain Suslov. I have questions about German artillery doctrine. I am required to provide only name, rank, and service number." "This is correct. However, cooperation will be noted in your file. Non-cooperation will also be noted." The unspoken threat was clear. Cooperate and be treated according to Geneva Conventions. Refuse and face consequences. Hartmann had heard reports about German treatment of Soviet prisoners. He had no illusions about how the Soviets might treat German prisoners in return. "What do you wish to know?" Why did German artillery fail to counter Soviet artillery superiority? It was a professional question. Not about tactics or positions or specific operations. About fundamental doctrine. Hartmann found himself answering honestly. Perhaps because it no longer mattered. Perhaps because he was too tired to lie. "We failed because we attempted to maintain quality when we needed quantity. We built sophisticated fire control systems when we needed more guns. We rationed ammunition when we needed to flood the battlefield with shells. We fought the war we wanted to fight instead of the war we needed to fight." This is an accurate assessment. Of course it is accurate. I have spent 4 years watching Soviet artillery evolve from chaotic to overwhelming. Your doctrine was correct. Our doctrine was elegant but insufficient. Suslov made notes, asked more questions. Technical questions about German ammunition production, logistics systems, training methods. Hartmann answered all of them. What did German military secrets matter when Germany was being destroyed? After an hour, Suslov closed his notebook. "You will be transported to a prisoner camp near Moscow. Senior officers are held separately. Conditions are adequate. You will be informed of developments regarding your status. May I ask a question?" "You may ask." "My son was reported missing at Kursk last year. Lieutenant Peter Hartmann, 2nd Company, 19th Infantry Regiment. Is there any way to determine if he survived? If he is in Soviet custody?" Suslov's expression softened slightly. "I will make inquiries. Many prisoners were captured at Kursk. Records exist. If your son is alive, we will locate him." "Thank you." It was a small hope, probably meaningless, but it was something to hold on to in the darkness of defeat. 2 weeks later, Hartmann was transported to a prisoner camp outside Moscow. The camp held perhaps 2,000 German officers. Conditions were as Suslov had promised. Adequate. Not comfortable, but not deliberately cruel. Sufficient food. Medical care. Organized routines. Hartman existed in the camp without purpose. He walked the perimeter, read books from a small library, played chess with other prisoners, waited for the war to end, waited to learn his fate. In August, a guard summoned him to the camp commandant's office. Captain Suslov was there, the intelligence officer who had interrogated him at Bobruisk. General Major Hartman, we have located your son. The world stopped moving. Hartman could not breathe, could not speak, simply stood, waiting for Suslov to continue. Lieutenant Peter Hartman is alive. He was captured at Kursk during the Soviet counteroffensive in July 1943. He has been held at a prisoner camp in Voronezh. He is in adequate health. He has been informed that you are alive and in Soviet custody. Alive. Peter was alive. Had been alive for over a year while Hartman had believed him dead. Had survived Kursk. Had survived captivity. Was somewhere in Russia, breathing and living and existing. Can I see him? That can be arranged. It will take time to coordinate transport. Perhaps several weeks. But yes, you can see him. Hartman sat down. His legs would not support him. All the control he had maintained through defeat and capture and interrogation dissolved. He put his face in his hands and wept. Suslov waited quietly, then said, "You are a father before you are a general." This is understood. 6 weeks later, Hartman was transported to Voronezh. The journey took 3 days by train. He was escorted by 2 guards who treated him with professional courtesy. They arrived at the camp in late September. The weather was turning cold, another Russian winter approaching. Peter was brought to a meeting room, 23 years old now, thinner than Hartman remembered, harder, but alive, unmistakably alive. They embraced, father and son, enemy soldiers who were also simply 2 people who loved each other. They held each other for a long time. Neither spoke. Words were inadequate. Finally, they separated, sat across from each other at a wooden table. A Soviet guard stood in the corner, but gave them privacy. "Father," Peter's voice was rough. "They told me you were captured at Bobruisk. I thought you were dead. I thought you were dead at Kursk. I have thought so for over a year. I was wounded in the leg. Not seriously. The bone was not broken. I was captured during the retreat. Since then I have been here. Have they treated you well?" "Adequately. Better than we treated their prisoners. I think they feed us, house us, do not torture us. It is more than many deserve." Hartman heard the bitterness in his son's voice, understood what it meant. Peter had seen things, had learned things about the war that Hartman had tried not to see, about what Germany had done in Russia, about the camps and the mass executions and the systematic cruelty. "Peter, father, please, do not apologize for the war. Do not try to explain. We lost. We deserved to lose. Not because the Soviets had more guns or more shells, because what we were fighting for was evil. I understand that now. I did not understand it when I was 19 and believed in Germany's destiny. But I understand it now." They sat in silence. The guard in the corner looked away, granting them what privacy he could. "What will happen to us?" Peter asked. "I do not know. The war is not yet over. When it ends, we will be held until the Soviets decide to release us. Years. Probably. But we will survive. We are together. That is more than I hoped for. Mother, I have had no word. But she was in Berlin when I was captured. Berlin has not fallen. She may be alive. Maybe alive. That is the mathematics of this war. Is it not? Probability calculations. Perhaps alive. Perhaps dead. Perhaps it matters. Perhaps it does not." Hartman recognized his own cynicism in his son's words. The same cold calculation that had allowed him to function through years of war. The same detachment that turned people into numbers and deaths into statistics. "Peter, we survived. Others did not. We have that gift. We must not waste it by losing our humanity in bitterness." Humanity. Peter laughed without humor. Where was humanity in this war? Where was humanity when we invaded? Where was humanity in the camps? Where was humanity in the artillery bombardments that killed thousands in hours? I do not have answers, but I know that if we allow this war to destroy what we are beyond our military defeat, then we lose more than Germany lost. We lose ourselves. They talked for 2 hours about the war, about survival, about what might come next. When the guards indicated their time was ending, they embraced again. "We will see each other again." Hartman said, "We will survive this. We will go home eventually." "Yes, father." It was hope, fragile and uncertain, but it was something to hold on to. Meanwhile, the war continued. By October 1944, Soviet forces had liberated all of Belarusia, had advanced into Poland, were approaching the borders of Germany itself. The Wehrmacht was being systematically destroyed, not through climactic battles, through mathematics, through artillery, through the relentless application of overwhelming firepower. In April 1945, the final offensive began. The assault on Berlin. Volkov commanded artillery for the attack from the east. 41,600 guns, the largest concentration of artillery in human history. Ammunition stockpiled for weeks, plans refined to perfect precision. He stood at his observation post on the Silo Heights, looking toward Berlin. April 16th, 0300 hours. Darkness covered the landscape, but in 90 minutes, that darkness would be replaced by fire. Beside him stood Dmitri. His son had traveled from Moscow to witness the final battle. He walked with a slight limp now. The burns on his back had healed, but left scars that would never fully fade. He could not raise his left arm above his shoulder, but he was alive, was teaching, was passing on the lessons learned. Father, Dmitri's voice was quiet. When this bombardment begins, it will be visible from space. If there were anyone in space to see it, yes, all of this, all these guns, all these shells, all these years, was it necessary? Volkov did not answer immediately. He thought about the question, about the price paid, about the mathematics that had consumed him since 1941, about the son standing beside him who bore scars from those calculations. I do not know if it was necessary. I only know it was what we chose. What I chose, whether that choice was correct, history will judge, but we survived. The Soviet Union survived. Germany will be defeated. That is what the mathematics produced. At what cost? At terrible cost. But the alternative was worse. They stood in silence, waiting for 0430, waiting for the thunder to begin. When it came, it exceeded everything that had come before. 41,000 guns firing simultaneously. The sky turned white with muzzle flashes. The earth shook so violently that men had difficulty standing. The sound was beyond hearing, beyond comprehension. It was the sound of industrial civilization turning its full power toward destruction. The bombardment lasted 25 minutes. Then Soviet infantry attacked, supported by tanks, covered by artillery that continued firing. The German defensive line on the Silo Heights held for 6 hours. Then it broke. Soviet forces poured through, racing toward Berlin. The battle for Berlin lasted 2 weeks. House by house, street by street, block by block. German resistance was fierce but hopeless. Soviet artillery reduced buildings to rubble. Soviet infantry cleared the rubble. Soviet tanks moved forward. On May 2nd, German forces in Berlin surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Volkov received the news in his command bunker. Around him, staff officers celebrated, shouted, embraced each other. The war they had fought for 4 years was finished. They had survived. The Soviet Union had survived. They had won. Volkov felt nothing. No joy, no relief, only exhaustion. And the weight of all the decisions he had made, all the lives he had calculated, all the prices that had been paid. Dmitri found his father sitting alone outside the bunker, looking toward Berlin, toward the city that was still burning, toward the end of everything. Father, it is over. Yes. We won? Yes. Dmitri sat beside his father. They did not speak for a long time. Two men who had survived, who had paid prices, who now had to determine what victory meant when the cost had been so high. Finally, Volkov spoke. Your mother asked me to keep you safe. I failed, but you survived. That is something. You did not fail. I am alive. Others are alive. The artillery doctrine saved lives. More lives than any alternative strategy. You know this. I know the mathematics. But mathematics do not account for everything. Do not account for burns that scar your body. Do not account for the nightmares that will haunt us. Do not account for the humanity we lost in calculations. Then what do they account for? Survival, victory, the continuation of our nation. Perhaps that is enough. Perhaps it has to be enough. They sat together as the sun rose over Berlin, father and son, general and teacher. Two survivors of a war that had consumed millions. Volkov put his hand on his son's shoulder. The road ahead will be long. More battles, more losses. Germany will not surrender easily. But we will win. Not because we are better soldiers, not because we have better equipment, but because we can outlast them. Artillery gives us that ability. Dmitri looked at his father. When this war is over, what will become of people like us? Tank officers who learn that tanks are not the decisive weapon. You will teach the next generation. You will ensure they understand that war is mathematics and survival and the willingness to pay terrible prices. You will pass on the lessons we learned in blood. And you, father, what will you do? Volkov looked toward Berlin, where hundreds of thousands of men had died in the final battle. I will finish what we started. I will use artillery to break what remains of German power. And when the war is over, I will try to remember what it felt like to be something other than a calculator of death. 17 months later, in October 1946, Volkov received a message. A German prisoner of war wished to speak with him. General Major Wilhelm Hartmann, former artillery commander, being held at a camp outside Moscow. The request had been approved at high levels. The meeting would take place at a military headquarters in Moscow. Volkov agreed. He was curious, had read Hartmann's interrogation reports, had studied German artillery doctrine through the lens of Hartmann's analysis, respected the man's professional competence, even if they had been enemies. The meeting room was simple. A table, 2 chairs, a guard posted outside but giving them privacy. Hartmann was escorted in, 50 years old now, thinner than his photograph suggested, but dignified, unbroken despite defeat and captivity. They sat across from each other. 2 artillery commanders, 2 fathers, 2 men who had fought the same war from different sides. Hartmann spoke first. In careful Russian, General Volkov, thank you for agreeing to meet. Your Russian is excellent. I have had time to practice. 18 months of captivity provides opportunity for language study. Your son survived Kursk. This is in your file. He is here in Moscow. Yes, we have been allowed to see each other monthly. It is a gift I did not expect. Volkov nodded. My son survived Kursk as well. He was wounded. Burns. His combat career ended. But he survived. Then we are both fortunate. More fortunate than we deserved. They sat in silence, understanding passing between them without words. The understanding of fathers who had sent their sons into war, who had lived with the fear of loss, who had been granted the mercy of survival. General Volkov, I requested this meeting because I wish to ask you a question. As one professional to another, ask it. You defeated us. Not through tactics, not through generalship, through artillery, through the systematic application of overwhelming firepower. I have studied your campaigns. Stalingrad, Kursk, Bagration, Berlin. Every operation followed the same pattern. Concentrate artillery. Destroy defensive positions. Exploit with mobile forces. It was not elegant, but it was effective. This is not a question. The question is this. Did you ever doubt? Did you ever question whether the cost was too high? Whether the casualties were acceptable? Whether victory through mathematics was victory at all? Volkov looked at the German general, saw the same exhaustion in Hartmann's eyes that he saw in his own mirror. The same weight, the same burden of command. Every day, every battle, every casualty report. I questioned everything. But you continued. I continued because stopping meant losing. Losing meant Germany would destroy the Soviet Union, destroy my people, destroy my son. I chose mathematics over morality, chose effectiveness over humanity, chose victory regardless of cost. Was I right? I do not know. But I made the choice and I will live with it. Hartmann nodded slowly. We are the same. You and I, we commanded artillery. We calculated casualties. We traded lives for objectives. The difference is that your calculations were correct and mine were not. You had the industrial capacity to support your doctrine. Germany did not. That is why you won and we lost. That is only part of why we won. What is the other part? Volkov chose his words carefully. We were willing to pay any price. Germany wanted conquest. We needed survival. That difference meant we could endure losses that would have broken any nation fighting for anything less. So victory went to whoever could suffer most. No, victory went to whoever could suffer most while maintaining the ability to continue fighting. That required artillery, required the doctrine, required the mathematics, but it also required something beyond mathematics. Will, determination, the refusal to accept defeat regardless of cost. Hartmann was quiet for a moment. Then he said, when I was captured at Bobruisk, Soviet artillery destroyed my defensive position in 6 hours. 200 guns against 4,000. The mathematics were inescapable. We could not win, could never have won. The war was decided by production tables and ammunition stockpiles, not by battlefield tactics. Yes, my son told me we deserved to lose, not because of mathematics, because what Germany fought for was evil. Do you believe this? Volkov met Hartmann's eyes. I believe Germany invaded the Soviet Union. I believe millions of Soviet citizens died. I believe Soviet artillery killed millions of German soldiers. Who deserved what is a question for philosophers? I am a soldier. I fought the war. I needed to fight to achieve the outcome I needed to achieve. That is all. That is not all. That is everything. You reduced war to mathematics and won. I attempted to preserve humanity in warfare and lost. The lesson is clear. The lesson is that modern industrial war cannot be fought with humanity intact. It can only be fought with calculation and will. The price of victory is the loss of everything that makes victory meaningful. But we pay the price because the alternative is worse. They sat in silence. Two men who understood each other completely. Who had made the same choices? Who bore the same burdens? Who would carry the weight of those decisions until death? Finally, Hartmann spoke again. I will be repatriated to Germany next year. Soviet policy is to release prisoners gradually. My son and I will return home. To whatever remains of Germany, we will rebuild our lives. But I will never forget this war. We'll never forget the mathematics that defeated us. I will never forget either. But I must teach the next generation, must ensure they understand that artillery, properly used, can break any defense. That is my duty now, to preserve the lessons learned in blood. And your son, what is his duty? He teaches as well. Artillery tactics, combined arms doctrine. He passes on the knowledge, despite his scars, despite the cost he paid. Hartmann nodded. Then perhaps that is the meaning. Not victory or defeat, not mathematics or humanity. Simply passing on knowledge so the next generation need not learn everything from their own mistakes. Perhaps they parted. Two artillery commanders who would never meet again. Two fathers who had survived. Two men who had calculated the cost of victory and would spend the rest of their lives questioning whether the price had been worth paying. Volkov returned to his duties. Training officers, writing doctrine, ensuring the Red Army maintained the artillery superiority that had won the war. He worked until 1952. When he retired at age 56, he spent his retirement in a small apartment in Moscow. Dmitri visited weekly. They played chess, discussed tactics, never discussed Kursk, never discussed the burns, never discussed the choices that had been made. Volkov died in 1958. At age 62, heart attack, quick and without suffering. Dmitri was with him at the end. His last words were, "The mathematics were correct, but I wish they had not been necessary." Dmitri continued teaching until 1973, trained thousands of Soviet artillery officers, passed on the doctrine his father had developed, ensured that Soviet artillery remained the dominant weapon of the Red Army. He died in 1984. At age 62, the same age his father had died, his students remembered him as demanding but fair, scarred but unbroken, a living reminder of what war cost and what victory required. The artillery doctrine developed by Mikhail Volkov remained central to Soviet military thinking for decades. Was used in Afghanistan, in Chechnya, influenced Russian military planning into the 21st century. The principle remained the same. Overwhelming firepower. Concentration at the decisive point. Mathematics over elegance. Hartmann and his son returned to Germany in 1947. They found their home destroyed. Hartmann's wife had died in the bombing of Berlin. They rebuilt their lives slowly. Hartmann never spoke publicly about the war. Worked as an engineer. Died in 1971. At age 77, Peter became a teacher, married, had children, passed on different lessons than his father had learned. Lessons about the cost of war, about the danger of nationalism, about the importance of questioning orders. He died in 2003. At age 82, the two families never communicated, never knew that their fathers had met in Moscow in 1946, never knew that two artillery commanders had sat together and questioned the mathematics that had determined victory and defeat. But the legacy remained. In doctrine, in teaching, in the understanding that modern war is mathematics and will, and the willingness to pay prices that should never be demanded. The price of thunder, paid in blood and scars and lost humanity. Necessary and terrible, effective and unforgivable. The story of how artillery defeated armor, how production defeated tactics, how mathematics defeated philosophy, and how two fathers survived to question whether survival justified everything they had done to achieve it. The guns fell silent in May 1945. But the echoes continued, through decades, through generations, through the memories of those who fought and those who survived and those who calculated the costs and knew they could never be fully paid. This was the price of thunder. This was the mathematics of victory. This was the legacy of those who chose duty over humanity and lived to wonder if they had chosen correctly. The answer never came. Perhaps there was no answer. Perhaps there was only the doing, and the remembering and the passing on of knowledge purchased with blood. Perhaps that was enough. Perhaps it had to be enough, because there was no alternative. There had never been an alternative. And that was the most terrible calculation of all.